What's up, duelists? Today is the moment that most of you guys have been waiting for. Today is going to be the comprehensive Edison Format 2022 Year Start tier list. First things first, 2021 was a pretty big year for Edison. We hosted 3 major tournaments between Edison Legends, Rise of Edison, and Pump King of Games. And there was 3 other tournaments that were around the same size, not quite as big as those 3, but big enough that I've chosen to include them into factoring in metagame data and decisions behind this tier list. Those tournaments were the Edison Format 1K, the PlayStation 5 Paper Tournament, and there was a YRS, I believe that was like around 70 players. These 3 will also factor into our metagame data. I think we should start things off by defining what I think each of these tiers mean. I think S tier can be a little bit hard to define in a format this diverse. For the S tier in this specific tier list, we're going to focus on decks that have very powerful turn 1 plays, get to play the best spell cards, and also have great longevity as well as the results to back it up. A tier are going to be decks that I believe can win a major tournament on their own. They're going to have maybe 1 or 2 bad matchups, but overall don't need a significant amount of bracket luck in order to win a major tournament. B tier are decks that I think are quite good, but do need a specific metagame or a specific amount of bracket luck in order to win a major tournament or even top a major tournament. C tier are going to be decks that I think are a little underpowered, but with some accurate technical play, maybe you could get a top 8 or potentially win a smaller event with them. D tier are going to be decks that I can't in good faith recommend that you play. And E tier and F tier are going to be obviously fucking garbage. Meme shit. I've included a lot of lists, not just the decks that have made top 8 in the last 6 major events, but also a lot of decks that we've played in the channel. And I'm going to rate them, I think, as accurately as I possibly can, given that we have very little data on a lot of these decks. Let's go ahead and hop right into things. The first deck I want to rank is a mainstay in the format. It's a deck I did a video on recently, going into detail on all the card choices in the deck. This deck is Blackwings. I think Blackwings are one of the strongest decks in the format, if not the strongest deck in the format. They're a very clear S tier pick for me. Going first, they have Black Whirlwind, which is a card that can easily dominate games. They have one of the best removal traps in the game, which is Icarus Attack, and all of their monsters are power crept, which is kind of hard to deal with if you're playing a more average aggro deck. Also, we can check out here, I have a graph of all of the top 8 decks from the 6 major tournaments. From the biggest 3, I factored in the top 8 decks, and then from the PS5 tournament, we only have data on the first place deck, so I've included that. And from the smaller 4 and 5 tournaments, I've included the top 4 data. As you can see here, Blackwing, top 4 decks topped. Blackwing 4, 4 Blackwing. Yes, good deck. Blackwing, good deck. Blackwing, good deck. This might be a little bit of spoilers for the rest of the tier list, but you can kind of see Blackwing, good deck. Yes, Blackwing S tier. Let's go. Next up, maybe a deck that people are fond of in this format, but a deck that I think is not really that good is Quick Draw Dandelion. I think this deck is underpowered. I don't think this deck has what it takes to consistently win or even top major events. As you can see here in our graph, Quick Draw got 1 top in all of the 6 tournaments. It needs a little bit of bracket luck, and it needs little bit of, in general, just draw luck in order to win anything. I'm going to put it towards the bottom of B tier. This will fill out more as we get into things. I also think Quick Draw does very poorly against some of the decks that are going to end up here in the S tier and the A tier. Next up, a deck that I am super high on, but unfortunately it doesn't really have the numbers to back it up, is Fairies. This deck is very powerful. Archlord Christia is a very powerful card. However, this deck can get metagamed against pretty easily with stuff like Defissure and Light Imprisoning Mirror and Banisher, and there's a lot of cards you can tech that kind of give this deck a hard time. I also think that this deck has a very high ceiling, but also a very low floor. When you're playing this deck to maybe a suboptimal level, it's going to be a lot worse than playing something like Blackwings to a suboptimal level. So I think I'm going to have to put Fairies either at the bottom of A or the top of B. We'll see where this goes. They do have 1 top here, but I can't in good faith put them higher than A, given that the results aren't there to back them up quite yet. This is definitely a really powerful deck. Definitely don't sleep on it. But I think it's either a bottom of A or a top of B right now. It does need a little bit of bracket luck, so I think it's going to end up being top of B, just because you have to dodge specifically Deck Devastation Virus in the main deck, and you have to dodge a few other random hate cards like Defissure in the main deck in order for it to really, really succeed. The deck does perform well against some of the higher tier decks though, so I could easily see this moving up to A in the future, especially as players develop their skills more and are able to play these higher power level decks to a higher proficiency. We've got the deck that won the PlayStation 5 paper tournament, which is Gravekeepers. I think Gravekeepers is a pretty strong deck. I think they have a lot of cheese factor in Royal Tribute. Of course, they are missing Pot of Duality, Solemn Warning, and Gravekeeper Recruiter, which is what turns them into a high S tier deck in later formats. But I think this deck, with the right bracket luck, similar to these other decks in the B tier, it could easily win a tournament like it did in the PS5 paper tournament. I don't think this deck particularly matches up well against Blackwings in our S tier deck, but there are a few other decks that we'll get to that I think Gravekeepers does fairly well against. Next up, another fan favorite deck in Blackwing Vayu Turbo. People know this deck, people love this deck. I think this is a solid deck. I think it doesn't quite have what it takes to be an S tier deck. There's no, broken start in Black Whirlwind or Future Fusion or Charge plus Recharge or whatever. But I think it is a solid deck. It does get to play a lot of really powerful middle game cards like Burial from the Different Dimension, Dark Arm Dragon. I think it's one of the best brain control decks, which is an interesting thing to say. I also think it's one of the best card trooper decks, and I think that card is fantastic. So I think this is a solid A tier deck. This deck doesn't need a ton of bracket luck in order to win. Of course, dodging Gravekeepers would be nice, but that's not a very common deck. And I think between the removal that Raikou and Caius offer, as well as potentially Icarus Attack, Deck Devastation Virus, this deck can adapt to a lot of different situations very easily. If you look at our graph again, Vayu got one top in all of our tournaments, but I do think it has the potential to get more, and it had a few top 16 placings in the larger tournaments, so I think it's definitely an A tier deck for me. I'm going to go through a few of the memer picks that we have played on the channel and place them in just some random arbitrary places because, hey, these decks are fun. I wanted to include them on the tier list because they are real decks. They are decks that you could definitely face off against, but I don't think they are decks that necessarily will win major tournaments or even really top major tournaments unless they are piloted by someone who's just really cracked. Immortal Bushi, I think, is a D tier deck. Remove Brainwashing, I think, is a D tier deck. I mean, it's a fun deck, but as soon as your opponent knows what they're doing against it, it can be really tough to play. Obviously, you have Nut Hands, which are just crazy OTK combos, but those are few and far between. You don't really have cards like Pot of Duality, Pot of Prosperity in later formats that help you fix your hands and make sure you draw those combos frequently. Another one of the memer decks that I think is actually kind of decent and can get there with some bracket luck is Uriah, Lord of Searing Flames control. I think this is a C tier deck. I think Floodgates are pretty good in this format. Obviously, the removal is amazing between Raikou, Dust Tornado, Icarus, Heavy Storm, Trunade, Cold Wave, Space Typhoon, all of that stuff, Caius, even Ryza, cards that most decks play a lot of copies of. Another fun fact, Caius is the most played card in top 8s. Pretty interesting to think about. I think Uriah has a chance where it can, potentially with the right bracket luck and the right floodgate configuration, it could get into top in a tournament. So I think putting it in C tier is fair over decks like Immortal Bushi and Lava Golem. Another memer deck, Relinquished Quick Draw. I think this deck is slightly better than the actual Quick Draw deck in a lot of circumstances. However, because of the prevalence in Royal Oppression, as you'll note in some of the higher tier decks like Vayu, Blackwing, and a few of the other ones we'll get into, like Fairy, Gravekeepers, they all play Royal Oppression. I think Relinquished Quick Draw is worse against Royal Oppression than the regular Quick Draw deck, and so I'm going to have to put it in C tier. There's a lot of power in this deck. Preparation of Rites is a really strong card, and Relinquish is also a really strong card in and of itself. You get to play a lot of really good engine cards. I think this deck does a very good job at maximizing the value of Raikou Mills, and you do get to play cool cards like Chaos Force. So I think it's a solid deck. I think it's a little bit better than Immortal Bushi and Remove Brainwashing, but again, it's one of the memer decks that we play on the channel. Next memer deck is the Equipment Cat deck. I can't in good faith put this deck higher than E tier or F tier, however you really want to put it. This deck is really sweet, and when it combos off, it looks broken as hell, but you are playing cards like Silver Fang and Symbols of Duty in your main deck, and these cards aren't really conduits for having consistent draws. One of the other decks that I've played on the channel that I think is quite a good deck is the Telidad deck. This deck gets to play a large number of powerful one-of cards, like Dark Arm Dragon, you know, fucking Emergency Teleport, all the powerful dark cards, Allure of Darkness. I think you do get to play a lot of cards that I think don't have a home in this metagame, but are good cards, like Doom Caliber Knight and Phoenix Wing Windblast. I think this deck is quite solid. I would honestly argue that it's better than Quick Draw Dandy Warrior, especially because you get to play, you know, essentially the same cards. You get to play 3 Caius, you get to play like a heavy Synchro engine, but you're a lot stronger against Oppression. I think you have a little bit of a higher ceiling. You have more OTK potential than the Quick Draw deck. In general, I think it's a fairly strong Synchro / anti-meta deck if that's something you're interested in. Next up, for decks we've covered on the channel, is X-Sabers. I think X-Sabers is also a strong deck. I think this deck can win a major tournament or top a major tournament. I think it needs a little bit of bracket luck. It is very heavy combo focus. I think you need to dodge a few things in order for X-Saber to do really, really well. It struggles with some of the top tier decks, which we'll get into a little bit later. Again, I'll talk about matchups once the whole tier list is fleshed out a bit more. But I think this deck is solid. I think that it has a lot going for it. And I think if you can survive a few turns with this deck and pull off a big combo, it's one of the better combo decks in the format. Next up, we've got a deck that I think has fallen off a lot. It's Gadgets. This deck is interesting, right? Because in theory, oh, you +1 every turn, it's very good. It's very strong. I have trouble placing this deck higher than C tier. It's low power level, right? I mean, summoning a Gadget every turn, you're just going to get bursted or OTK'd or destroyed by one strong push or a Stardust Dragon, or I don't know. I mean, this deck just loses to a lot. Sure, you're getting a +1, but you're spending your normal summon on a shitty monster in order to do that. You have to factor in that the deck is like ultimately playing behind tempo the entire time. It's very difficult for this deck to keep up with the aggression that some of these other decks can output, and I think that you can easily get yourself into situations against very basic setups that are really, really awkward. Next up is a deck I played recently on the channel, and I think that's the Vayu Sworn deck. It's a combination between Lightsworn and Blackwing Vayu. I think this deck is, you know, it's a contender. I think this is a strong deck. I think it's something that we could definitely see more of in the future. I think we should probably talk about Lightsworn right now as well, just because it's very similar to Lightsworn, but it has, I think, a little bit more aggression and a little bit less resilience to things like, I don't know, Graveyard Hate, Soul Release. Lightsworn, I think, is an S tier deck. It's the bottom of S tier, probably either that or the top of A tier. This deck is very powerful. It's put up 4 tops. However, I don't think this deck is quite as good as the other S tier decks in this. I think Lightsworn can be a little bit high variance in your draws. You can oftentimes draw a ton of your bricks, and that, it leads me to believe that it's not quite as powerful as the other decks because you're forced to play these bricks to get that high power level. Whereas the other 3 decks aren't necessarily playing bricks to the same degree that the Lightsworn deck is. You can also run into awkward problems where your normal summon is like Book of Moon and you never start milling, and your deck just never gets online. This can become very awkward in the early stages of the Lightsworn game, where if they fumble in the opening, they pretty much just fucking lose. However, between Charge of Light Brigade and Solar Recharge, as well as being probably one of the best Gold Sark decks and the best Cold Wave decks, it's gotta be an S tier deck. It's just gotta be an S tier deck. Judgment Dragon is still a busted card, and Raikou, Lila, that sort of Celestia engine is still very good. So definitely S tier deck, definitely an S tier deck. Potentially higher A tier, actually. Maybe not definitely S tier, but you know it's up here. It's up here. If you want to roll the dice, play some Lightsworn. Next up is a deck that got a couple of tops this last format, and that deck is Diva Frogs. I think Diva Frogs is a very, very strong deck. I think this deck has a lot of potential. It doesn't struggle with a lot of the same things that Frog Monarchs struggles with, which I'm going to rate right now. I think Frog Monarchs is, in hindsight, a bit of a weaker deck. Similar to Gadgets, maybe a little bit stronger because your monsters that you're summoning are more powerful. However, the Monarch deck is more vulnerable to floodgates like Mask of Restrict. It's more vulnerable to your normal summon getting stopped. I think the Diva Frog deck has a little bit more play to things. You've got Synchro access, which I think is very good. Having access to things like Bryonic can help you against certain floodgates. Having access to things like Black Rose Dragon can help you in certain board states. And I think the Diva Frog deck does a better job of playing Deck Devastation Virus, which is a very powerful sideboard card against a lot of strategies in this format. Ultimately, I think Diva Frog is slightly stronger than Frog Monarch. You'll notice that Frog Monarch got 1 top in the last year, and Diva Frog got 2. I mean, that's kind of how I feel about the decks in general. Next up, another S tier deck, clear S tier deck, is Dragons. I think Dragons are really fucking broken. They have 3 tops in this last year, 2021. Now, we've got a couple different dragon builds, right? We've got the trap, like Floodgate dragon builds, and then we've got the dragon turbo build that was popularized by Hydro Pump. I'm kind of lumping them together because they more or less are just Future Fusion decks. Future Fusion is a god card in this. It's probably the best single spell card in the format if you open it going first. It leads you to auto +3, usually +4 potentially. And the pluses are very real. There are positive tempo, huge monsters that put more monsters from your graveyard into play. It's just like, it's super, super broken. On top of that, Red Eyes Darkness Metal is probably the best boss monster in the format. Maybe second best next to Christia. It's hard to compare the two. I think Red Eyes Darkness Metal is like one of the easiest boss monsters to summon. It also has the highest impact effect where you can just like kill people out of nowhere. The Dragon deck can do something like Red Med plus Drago, attack for 4,700. All of a sudden the opponent's at 3,300. And even if they break this board, even if the Red Med and the Drago die, one other Red Med plus the Drago back from grave is another, like, that's lethal over a lot of different things. So I think this deck is very dangerous. It's very scary burst potential. It has a lot of resilience against floodgates and against hate cards just because the average monster quality is so high. The deck can even just lean into the fact that Drago and Wyvern have huge stats and can attack over the majority of other monsters that may give some decks a problem, like Fossil Dino. Also, another thing that the Trap Dragon deck specifically has going for it is it gets to play Royal Oppression to great degree of effect. You have Totem Dragon, which lets you cheat out big monsters under Oppression, and you also have just, again, like I said, Beater, which do really well under Oppression. Clear S tier deck for me. If I had to pick a deck in this list so far to play in a tournament, I would definitely be picking between Dragons and Blackwings. Next up, we've got a deck that got 1 top, which is Flamvels. I think Flamvels are pretty bad. I'm a little biased though, and they did get a top, so I can't hate on that 1 top. So I gotta put them in B tier. The variance in draws is super, super high. In the games where you draw and resolve Flamvel Firedog, you feel like a god. Flamvel Firedog is clearly a very good card. However, in the games where you draw multiple Flamvel Magician, and you're just looking at your hand, and you have dead Rekindlings in the first 4 or 5 turns of the game, you have a lot of inactive cards, I think it's pretty bad. And normally, the decks that this likes to prey on are like Gadgets, and like Bushi, and Quick Draw to an extent. These decks aren't seeing a lot of play. Flamvel Firedog doesn't really match up super well against the Kalut Honest and like 1900 monster decks. So I think it's a little bit mid in the metagame, as well as being mid in general because of the high variance of the draws. It's definitely a deck you can play to some success, as we saw from User Souls Manic, but definitely not something I would recommend. Next up, 1900 Beat, Hero Beat. This deck is a deck that got top. This is definitely not the best Absolute Zero deck in the format, but a solid Absolute Zero deck, and it has the ability to play a ton of different floodgates to a large degree of success. I think Hero Beat is roughly around as powerful as Flamvel, if not a little bit more powerful. We're going to need to like expand this B tier a little bit. It's going to get a little bit clouded. Might even just bump Fairies up a little bit. There we go. Yeah, Hero Beat, solid deck. You get to play a lot of cool floodgates. Absolute Zero is a broken card. Speaking of which, Absolute Zero, Diva Hero, whatever you want to call it, the Destiny Hero, Diva, Future Fusion deck is very clearly the best deck in Edison format right now. Absolute Zero is fucking stupid. And the Diva Hero deck gets to play all of the broken shit on top of playing triple Miracle Fusion. This deck is nuts. Absolute Zero makes you super resilient to stuff like Judgment Dragon or Darkarm Dragon reversaling you, which all of these decks down here struggle with. Sans like Fairy. Stratos is an insane opener. You get one of the most powerful going second plays in the format, which is Evil Hero Infernal Prodigy into Caius. You get to play main deck Snowman Eater and maximize off of it. Snowman Eater makes it so like your aggro matchups, like stuff like Hero Beat, Flamvel, Blackwings, they just get fucked. They just run into a Snowman Eater and all of a sudden there goes all of their advantage from early game pressure. This deck is disgusting. On top of that, you get to play Diva Hero, which is more, or not Diva Hero, Deep Sea Diva, which is more or less the tour guide of this format. It's an auto +1 on the summon. It's a one card synchro. You get one card synchros, you get one card absolute zeros and Miracle Fusion. You get all sorts of powerful synergies. You get to play Future Fusion, which is the best spell card in the format. You get to play Dark Arm Dragon, which is one of the best monsters in the format. This deck is fucking stupid. It's fucking silly stupid. The fact that we were sleeping on it last year is really dumb. It's got the most tops out of any deck by far, especially if you factor in top 16s. It goes even higher. Obviously, for this graph, I didn't factor in the top 16s, but there was a fair number of absolute zero in the top 16s. If you're going to be playing Edison format in 2022, you got to have a plan for this deck. That's just it. You got to have something that deals with either Miracle Fusion or deals with absolute zero effectively once it's resolved. That's another reason why I think Necro Valley Gravekeepers is pretty good right now. I think they have a very good matchup against specifically absolute zero. I think moving forward, decks that have naturally good matchups against absolute zero are going to help sort of push it out of the metagame. We'll maybe see some push and pull in the next few months, especially in the larger tournaments. Next up is a deck that I was pretty high on early on in the format, but I think has fallen off. It's gotten absolutely zero tops. I think it needs the right metagame to even really do anything. I think it has some pretty bad matchups against Blackwing's Absolute Zero, Lightsworn, Vayu, and Fairies, as well as Gravekeepers to a degree. I think it's Fish combo. I think Fish combo is a little bit worse than X-Sabers right now, probably. It's still a really strong deck, and if you're resolving a Coelacanth, I mean, you're going to feel great no matter what. But I think you just lose to a little bit too much. And you need a lot of bracket luck, you need to dodge a lot of stuff, and ultimately your combo is not as resilient as it may seem. You need to have a sweeper, you need to have a Coelacanth, and you need to have a discard, you need to have 2 tributes. So it's essentially a 5-card combo. Obviously, a lot of these cards you can get for free, like Treeborn can count for one of the tributes or whatever. But on top of that, if any one of those parts of the combo is stopped, all of a sudden your deck does literally nothing. You just kind of fall apart. Maybe you're forced into a situation where you have to like Fishborg Synchro into something, or like try to get aggressive with a Unifrog. It's one of those decks where it's like weirdly resilient in some situations, but I think against the top decks, it's going to struggle a lot. And it needs a little bit of bracket luck as well as draw luck in order to go far in a big tournament. Next up, we've got another garbage deck from the videos, Salvo, Black Salvo, Salvo Machina, whatever. I think this deck is a C tier deck. It's fine, you know? It's a fine synchro deck. Level 7s are not that great in this format. Speaking of level 7s, I think the Power Tool Dragon decks in this format are not great. Power Tool Dragon is obviously amazing, but you do have to play at least 3 bricks to really do anything with this. Normally you're playing like 6 bricks to do anything with the Power Tool Dragon. And yeah, sometimes your bricks are pretty good cards like Mark of the Rose or, I don't know, Smoke Grenade of the Thief. But in general, drawing multiples of those cards early on is going to give you a tough time when you're facing off decks with all live cards like these in the S tier, A tier, and B tier. Zombies are a deck that I think we saw a little bit of success, but it might have been manufactured success. I'm hesitant to put this deck higher than B tier, even though it did get 2 tops in our last tournaments. They were tops that were incentivized by a specific type of prize support. So, maybe they're real, maybe it's not. I don't know. Realistically, I can't put this deck higher than Fairies or Diva Frog as of right now, just because it hasn't had success outside of that one tournament where there was prize incentive to play it. But it did win that tournament, and that was a pretty big tournament. So I don't know. I think it's a solid deck. I think it's pretty resilient to a lot of things. In practice, you get to play Return from the Different Dimension to great effect. You get to play Dark Arm Dragon to great effect, and you get to play Caius to great effect. So you get to play a lot of really strong cards. And the synchros you make, I mean, Bronic and Goyo Guardian are pretty fucking strong. So I think it's a solid deck. I think it's probably better than the other synchro combo decks in the format. Maybe on the same tier as Teledad, a little bit similar to that. It might be a little bit worse than X-Saber and Fish, but this is all marginal. Obviously, Zombies has the results to back it up, so I'm going to have to put it higher than them for now. Next up is a deck that fell off completely, Rescue Cat Syncro. This deck had 0 results in the last year. Even in the top 16, it didn't really do anything. I'll put this deck in D tier. You've got a lot of garnets for one powerful combo that only leads to like, 2 level 7s? It's kind of mid. The fact that Rescue Cat is worse when you're not playing things like Power Tool Dragon, it says a lot to how the format has shaped up. Potentially we could see some cat variants do well in the future. I think the Black Garden cat deck is really, really strong. I think it's a little bit underdeveloped as of right now. But as of right now, I gotta put it in D tier. I think it's a little bit sus to play Rescue Cat right now. Next up is a deck that I've memed a lot about on the channel, which is Koderas. Koderas is an interesting deck. I think when you incorporate cards like Absolute Zero, it's a solid C tier deck. You have a really powerful combo in Koderas plus Legendary Ocean. Even if you factor in the fact that Koderas itself isn't necessarily a +1 because it's so fucking weak and it is just going to get run over no matter what. Even a 2-for-2 that doesn't hard destroy can be really hard for some decks to deal with. Koderas dodges stuff like Starlight Road, Stardust Dragon, lets you pick off a lot of fucking annoying back row or like monsters that are sticky like Gravekeeper Spy or Christia or whatever. I think Koderas has a really good matchup against stuff like Necro Valley, and I think it actually has a pretty solid matchup against Blackwings. I don't think I can in good faith put it higher than some of these B tier decks that have actual tops. Until we see something with this deck, it's going to remain in the C tier. Next up is a deck that got one top in the last year, which is Volcanic Rocket. Volcanic Quick Draw, Volcanic Monarchs, Volcanic whatever. It got one top. It's going B tier. I think it's worse than Hero, but better than Flamvel. You guys are getting the point. A lot of B tier decks. That's Edison format. All right, that's Edison format. These are decks that need a little bit of bracket luck to top again. Next up is probably going to be the most contentious pick of this tier list. This is a deck that I think is fucking amazing and really, really slept on. It got one top in the Edison format 1K. It's a deck that when I first saw it, I was really skeptical of it. Ancient Gear Machina. It's the only Machina deck or machine deck to top in the last year, which is really surprising because Machina Gearframe and Machina Fortress are stupid cards. They are very, very power crept in the context of this format, and I think this deck maximizes on those two cards better than anything else. Another hidden synergy, or not synergy, but just like metagame advantage this deck has is it gets to play Gear Town to its full effect. Your main beater of the deck, which is Ancient Gear Gadgetron Dragon, blanks Mirror Force and D-Prison, which lets you play into back row really, really effectively. You also get to play Ancient Gear Beast, which on its own fucks like half of these decks. That card is so fucking stupid. You negate every flip effect monster besides like obviously Spy because you can't run it over. You negate like every like Sangan, Treeborn Frog gets negated permanently, and it's a 2000 normal summon that if you have Gear Town in play, which obviously you play 7 copies of if you count the Mausoleum as well, you can normal summon the Ancient Gear without a tribute. It's just a 2000. If it gets booked, it's hard to remove. It dodges D-Prison, Mirror Force. It runs over monsters like Raikou, like fucking Hamster. It just makes them look like memes. I think this deck is everything Flamvel wants to be, but straight up better. This is a really, really fucking scary deck. I think it might end up falling down to B tier if people start to play stuff like System Down in their sideboard in high numbers. But I think as of right now, I'm very confident putting this in A tier. I've played about 20 matches with the deck, and I haven't lost a single one, which I cannot say that about any other deck in here except maybe Blackwings. I've had some streaks that were like 10, 11 win streaks. But yeah, Ancient Gear, really strong deck. Definitely don't sleep on this. It's a nasty deck for sure. And the fact that you get to play stuff like Future Fusion, Overlord Fusion, Limiter Removal to great effect too, oof. You just kill people out of nowhere. Very fast, very dangerous deck. Be careful of that. Next up is Anti-Meta Stun. I think Anti-Meta obviously gets better when you know what the metagame is. But since the metagame is pretty hostile to anti-meta decks in general, I think decks like Blackwings, decks like Dragons, decks like Absolute Zero, they do fairly well against stun decks in general. I think it's going to be a C tier deck. Do a little rearranging of the C tier here. We're nearing the end. We're getting through a lot of these. We're getting through a lot of these decks. One of the decks that, everyone loves. Everyone loves Gladiator Beast. But also, everyone hates Gladiator Beast. I don't know. It's one of those decks, It's very heavily played. It also got a significant amount of tops. I've got to put Gladiator Beast in A tier. You'll notice that they got 4 tops in the last year. I think Gladiator Beast does better in the smaller tournaments and against players who don't really know how to play against back row. I think it's roughly on the same strength as something like Diva Frog. You can have really oppressive openings with this deck where you have Laquari, Chariot, Starlight Road, Bottomless, and a lot of decks just can't play the game into that. And this deck also is probably the best Rescue Cat deck in the format. Rescue Cat's a 1-card Heraclinos, which is disgusting. Heraclinos is one of the best boss monsters ever printed. So I don't know. I don't know how I feel about Glads. I haven't had a lot of personal success with the deck. Every time I load it up to try and do a video, I play like 4 or 5 games with it, and I'm just like, man, I don't want to play this deck, and I switch off of it. I think the monsters are pretty low impact, which is the weakness of the deck. It struggles with beater plus back row. I think it has a few really, really bad matchups like Hero Beat, Flamvel, and Anti-Meta give Gladiator Beasts a really, really hard time. I also don't really like the Blackwing matchup for Glads. I know a lot of people say it's close to 50-50, but if you're playing against a good Blackwing player, it's pretty fucking hard as a Gladiator Beast player. Also, this deck does a lot worse going second against some of the top decks. I think going first, Gladiator Beast against Lightsworn, against Dragons, it has a shot. But going second against Dragons, it's nearly unwinnable. And going second against Absolute Zero, it's not fun. I'll say it. It's not fun. You get behind on the Stratos, and then Stratos attacks over all your monsters, and it can be tough. It can be tough. This deck does a good job of gatekeeping, I think, the format. I think it does a good job of pushing decks like Gravekeepers, Fish, X-Sabers. To a degree, if Gladiator Beast is main decking D-Fissure, it can push Fairies out and stuff like Quick Draw out even. And I think it has a pretty decent matchup spread against the top decks, sans maybe Dragons and Ancient Gear. So I could see Glads winning a tournament. I wouldn't be the most surprised, but it's tough, right? It's tough. It's definitely not an S tier deck, despite it having that many tops, because the conversion rate of it is pretty low. I think it's the most played deck across all the tournaments by like 3 or 4%, and yet it doesn't have the most number of tops. I don't know. Gladiator Beast is a hard deck to place. It's a hard deck to place. Let me know in the comments below what you guys think about Gladiator Beast. All right, and that's it. I mean, that's all the decks that I think are worth ranking as of right now in Edison format. I'm sure there's some decks that I'm forgetting, I'm not thinking of. This format is super diverse. It's super wide. You can play fusions of these decks. You can play combination engines. One of the Gladiator Beast decks we saw even do well in the last major tournament. It was playing Hamster and Raikou, and like it was more like a quick draw deck than like a Gladiator Beast deck, which I think is crazy. I think a lot of these decks could have a lot of room to evolve. Edison format's really dope. I'm really excited to see what happens this year with the Ribbit Series tournaments. If you guys liked this video, if you guys found this video helpful, please make sure and subscribe, consider becoming a member. That sort of stuff helps the channel out a lot. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate the love on the rebrand as well. Everyone was really kind in the comment section. I honestly can't thank you guys enough. I have one of the coolest comment sections out of any YouTube channel I've ever seen, so shout outs to you guys. E3 Yu-Gi-Oh! Signing off. Peace out, everyone.